In this video, you are going to create events listeners inside the post controller. Basically, we would need to listen to events sent by the ChatGPT API and take action accordingly. So we're going to have a couple of event listeners. We're going to listen to data and we're going to listen to the event done. So let's start with the data event. So completion emitter on data. And here we're going to execute a function. And similarly, we're going to listen to the done event and execute another function. The function inside the data listener will need a parameter data. Now, to make our code more structured, I'm going to create a couple of functions. Data listener and done listener. Which will correspond to each of those functions. So let's create those functions. Let's start with the data listener. So it's going to take as a parameter data. And for example, we can just send a response as a JSON object. So I used json.stringify to make sure this data value is formatted as JSON. Now let's create our done listener. So this function doesn't take any parameter. Let's send a JSON object made of one key, which is event, that we set to done. Now, it's very important to understand that you are creating two connections here, a streaming connection between your backend or your server and the ChatGPT API server, and another connection or streaming connection to the React application from this backend. So after sending this result, we need to close the connection with the React application using results.end. And then we need to delete the listeners. So we're gonna use the off method rather than the on method to delete those listeners. Let's save. Now I'm going to make a quick change to the data listener function. As you can see, the data returned by the ChatGPT API is already in JSON format. So we don't need to transform data to JSON using the stringify method. So I'm going to delete this and simply result.write the data itself. And let's save. All right, now you would need to head over to the React application or the front end in order to write code that will respond to the events received through the streaming connection. I'm very excited to show you how to do that in the next video. In this video, you are going to write code to make your React application or your front end respond to those data chunks it receives from the backend. So if you head to /stream, this is what you get, which is exactly the same interface we had in the homepage. But if you try to run a prompt, you will get an error, as the code that we have at the moment works for a full response that you get from the server, not for a stream or a response that you get in small chunks. So we're going to update this code to accommodate a stream. Now, before moving on, to help you understand what is going on, let's just have a quick illustration of the different elements we've got in our application and how they interact with each other. First, we've got the API server, or the ChatGPT API server. That is the server responsible for generating responses for our prompts. And then we've got the backend, and that's our points of contact from the front end, and that's where we send the prompt in the first place. So first we send a fetch request from the front end to our backend, and we do that now in a streaming style. So what happens is that the prompt is sent from there to there, and then the backend is going to contact the ChatGPT API server. And again, we are using a stream in our scenario. So whenever the API server sends a chunk of data back to our backend is going to send that chunk of data to the front end or the React application. And then the React application is going to manipulate that data and display it as convenient. And that is exactly what you are going to do now in the React code. Alright, the first thing you need to change in the code is the fetch request. This format of the fetch request expects a full response from the server, although we are working with streams. So to accommodate streams, we need to add another parameter called signal. And I'm going to set that to a value signal, which I'm going to create later. So basically what we're doing here is that we are passing something called the abort signal. Now, how do we create that abort signal? Well, we are going first to create a variable called controller, which I'm going to set to an object that we're going to create using the AbortController class or method or constructor. So basically, this controller is going to be an instance of this class. So let's just add some comments to make our code easier to read. So this will create a new instance of AbortController. So what this controller does, it will be used to cancel our requests when needed. All right. Then we're going to create our signal variable, which we're going to set to the signal of the controller. So this will get the signal from the controller. So what we're doing here is that we are retrieving the abort signal objects from the controller. And this object is associated with the AbortController that we created earlier, and it will allow us to communicate and control the request cancellation. So let's just add a quick comment here. It will allow us to communicate and control the request cancellation. So that's how you change a traditional fetch request to a fetch request that accommodates a stream. Now, if the response.ok value is true, rather than getting the data in one go, we are going to use a reader. So how does it work? So let's create a variable reader and set it to response.body.getReader. So this will help us read the response incrementally. Now we don't have a data variable anymore, but I'm going to create a variable result data, which I'm going to set to an empty string for now. I'm using let as I'm going to change the value later on. And let's set the results at the moment to results data. And let's delete the JSON results for now. Now let's read the data we're going to receive through the data stream. So to do that, we're going to use a function of the reader object called read. So this function returns a promise, and it resolves to an object which contains a couple of values. So it contains the value property, which represents the data read from the stream, and it also comes with the done property. The done property will indicate whether the reader has reached the end of the stream or not. So that done property is set to false initially, and when we reach the end of the stream, it is set to true. So this is how the objects will look like. It's going to be value set to a certain value, and then done set to another value, and so on. Other parameters that we don't need. To save time, I'm going to paste the comments right there. So how are we going to get the value and the done values? So we're going to use destructuring. So we're going to set a constant value, and then done. And we're going to use the method read, which returns a promise. To do this, we're going to need to use the await keyword, and then reader.await, not read, sorry. Now, in order to read the data from the beginning of the stream until the stream stops, we're going to need to use a while loop. Our loop is going to stop when the value of done is set to true, which means that the stream has reached its end. So we're going to place this code inside the while loop. So we could be tempted to use the done variable right there, but it's not possible because we are declaring this as a constant right there. So I'm going to use another variable, and I'm going to call it reader done. And I would need to declare it just before. So at the beginning is going to be set to false, and our while loop is going to stop when reader done is set to true. So reader done is going to be set to true whenever we reach the end of the stream, and that will stop our loop. So let's add a condition right there. So if done, then we set reader done to true. Now, instead of this, you can just write value, comma, done. And that's how we use destructuring. So for now, I'm going to console.log the value and the done variables for each iteration. At the moment, whenever I save, we can see that a stream has started, and that's because we've got our start completion stream right there. So I'm going to comment that line, and now nothing is logged into our console, which means that we haven't started any stream. Now let's send a prompt to the backend and see what we get. If we check the terminal on the backend, we can see that the stream is generating data. So that's our backend. Now, if I check the front end by going to the console, we've got an error linked to the stream. So we're going to ignore that for now. but we don't have any outputs. Now let's check what's going on. Well, it looks like we need to check while reader done, or the opposite of reader done, as we're going to stop the while loop when reader done is set to true, which means that the opposite is false. So let's save and try again. And now we've got some outputs. And as you can see, we can't make sense of this data because we need to decode it. But you can see the value of the done variable, which is false, false, false. And when we reach the end of the stream, it is true. Now to decode the value of the value variable, we're going to use something called text decoder. And that's a constructor where we're going to pass UTF-8, which is the encoding used by our data. And then we're going to use the method decode of our value. Now let's save and try again. And this time we can see data that makes sense, and that's similar to the data that we have seen in the backend. As you can see, each data chunk is actually a completion. So you've got the ID of the completion, the choices, the text. So if we start from the beginning, you can see that we've got some text there with then the largest number of, and so on. Let's run the prompts again. And as you can see, we get the same thing. Let's try again. I'm just trying multiple times because sometimes the chunk of data is not one completion. As you can see in this case, we've got two completions there. That's the first completion with its ID right there. Well, that's the first two completions actually. So we've got one completion there, another completion there, and another completion there. So we've got no guarantee that the model returns one completion at a time. So sometimes it returns more than one completion. And that's very important when we try to manipulate this data in order to display the output on the front end. Now, if I scroll down to the bottom, we can see that the last element here is event done. Now, if I try again, the last element is event done as well. Let's try one more time. And this time we've got data done instead. So it's very important to analyze the data received by the model and understand how it is formatted and how we're going to manipulate it. As you can see, the data and the format of the data received is not very consistent. So we've got a bit of work to do in order to manipulate this data. Now, whenever I receive a data chunk, I'm going to store it inside a variable chunk. When we receive one completion, it is easy to manipulate because that is valid JSON, and we can extract any data that we want from that by parsing the JSON value. Now, when you receive a data chunk like this one containing 2 or 3 completions, that is not valid JSON. So we would need to transform that into a JSON array. So to do this, I'm going to need to add a comma at the end of each completion. One right there, for example, another one right there. So to do this, I'm going to replace these two curly brackets with the close curly brackets, then comma, then open curly brackets, and that will make sure we've got all these completions separated by commas. And then we're going to add brackets at the beginning and end of this value to make sure we've got a valid JSON array of completions. Let's go ahead and do this. So I'm going to store this code inside a variable chunk. So if done, we set the reader done to true. Otherwise, we will create a variable chunk. I'm going to use let's as I'm going to change it later. I'm going to set it to the decoded value. Now let's make some changes to the chunk variable. So we're going to replace all the instances of two curly brackets like this with two curly brackets separated by a comma. And that will make sure that all our completions are separated by commas. Also, let's place the output inside brackets like this. And let's console.log chunk like this. So let's try. And now we've got an array each time, or a JSON array. We haven't received any data chunk with more than one completion, so let's try again. Here we go. That's a good example. So this time we've got all the completions separated by commas. And we've got a valid JSON array. Now, we also need to get rid of things like data done and event done. But we will do that before separating the completions, as if I delete this right now, I'm going to be left with a completion inside this array followed by a comma. All right. So let's do that right there. Or let's do something better. So I'm going to replace these right there just before adding commas between the completions. And now let's save and try again. Now bear in mind that events done is still printed there because that happened when the value of done was set to true. So we didn't delete it, as we only delete them when done is set to false. So you can see here that we don't have anything appended to our completions that looks like events done or data done. Let's try again. And as you can see, the last completions that we've got here, they don't have any event done appended to them. Sometimes event done is sent on its own as one data chunk, and sometimes it's sent appended to the other completions, and that's when we delete it. Now let's pass our chunk variable as JSON and see if everything goes fine. So JSON pass chunk. And let's console.log it. Let's run the prompt. So we can see in the first example 3 completions and we've got no errors, so our JSON is valid, so it's got passed properly. Again, we've got our completion right there, we've got our choices, and we can access the text inside the choices. Now we're going to iterate through each of these arrays, extract the text value and display it in our results element. So we are adding text to the results element. So let's create a variable text and set it to an empty string to start with, and then run a loop over the elements of our chunk array. So for each of our chunks, we're going to get the choices array. And then we're going to check if the element exists, if there is a choices array and its length is greater than 0, meaning it's not empty, then we're going to add to our text variable the text stored inside the first element of choices, as we only consider the first choice. And then I'm going to add to the result data the value stored inside text. I'm not going to use that for now. We're going to come back to that later. And then I'm going to set the result to the previous value of a result plus the text. So to do this, you define a function inside like this. So instead of passing a value, you pass a function to set result. So this is how it works. So I'm going to use a parameter previous result. You can call it anything you like. And the output of the function is previous result plus text. Like this. So this is what it is returning. And basically what this function does is that it's going to get the previous value inside the result element and is going to add text to it and set it to the result element. So let's save and try our code. And as you can see, the results is streamed from the backend. To see this clearly, let's run the prompt with 10 countries. And as you can see, the streaming process works amazingly. As you can see, line breaks are not rendered properly here, and that's because React doesn't render the \n as a line break. And that happens when you set values using variables inside a React component. So to fix that, you can go to the result element, and rather than placing the value right there, you add a property dangerouslySetInnerHTML, and you set that to _HTML results. So this way, you'll be able to see the line breaks. We need 2 underscores right there. It's still not working. Let's add another property, style, and set it to whitespace preline. So this hopefully should fix it. And this time it is working. Now you can add more changes if you like. For instance, sometimes you've got 2 consecutive line breaks. So you can avoid that by replacing this in the output by 1 line break. So when you set the results, you can place this inside parentheses and then replace all double line breaks with 1 line break using the replace all function. So if I save and try again, we will avoid 2 consecutive line breaks. Now let's run the prompt one more time. It looks like there is an error parsing the JSON array. To debug this, I'm going to console.log the chunk variable before parsing and after parsing. So let's save and try again. As you can see, the problem occurred because after this completion, there is some space or line break followed by data colon followed by some space just before the start of the next completion. And this breaks our code because we expect these two completions to be sitting side by side with their open or close curly brackets and open curly brackets together in one place before inserting the comma. So using a regular expression, I'm going to replace this bit with simply the close curly brackets and open curly brackets. And I'm going to do that before inserting the comma. So let's do that right there. So let's save. And this time our code should work with no issues. Just a quick comment, this bit in the regular expression refers to optional white space around the data colon. So that's an optional white space, and that's also an optional white space. Now you can also display the data inside the JSON array elements as we did before with full completions. So let's go ahead and do this. So we are displaying the chunk array using the setJResult function. I'm going to display the array of chunks as a JSON array. So I'm going to use the same line of code we used earlier in the home.js file to stringify the array. And our array is going to be something like JResultsData. So I'm going to create this empty array right at the beginning. And then whenever we get a chunk, we push it to the array. All right, let's test our code. All right, in the results elements, we can see the list of countries being printed incrementally. And in the JSON elements, we can see our JSON array printed right there. So what you can do, you can look for all the text elements there. So Command F or Control F, and then you can keep going down and you see that we've got a line break, then another line break, then 1.United States, then line break, 2.India, and so on. And this matches exactly the results we've got in our results element. The interface that you have built makes it really easy to understand the streaming process when using streams with the ChatGPT API.